Hello, George. How are you?
How you doing, Glenn?
I'm doing well. This is Glenn Loury at Brown University, currently on leave at Stanford, and of bloggingheads.tv, The Glenn Show. And I'm happy to welcome George Borjas, an economist at the Kennedy School of Government. Indeed, George is the Robert Scrivener Professor of Economics and Social Policy at Harvard at the Kennedy School of Government. And George is an expert on immigration, on the economics of immigration. Um, and we are here to talk about George's new book that's getting ready to come out. So thanks so much, George, for joining
Well,
me.
thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is going to be fun and interesting because the issue is so important and it's coming to a head in the political campaign. The book, George's book, published by Norton, it's about to come out momentarily. I have a
Not quite.
pre-publication.
It's September. It's a few months.
Okay, so we're
Okay.
jumping the gun here. We're whetting your appetite. I'm sure it's possible to pre-order this book somewhere or another.
Most
But
definitely.
but in any case, it's called We Wanted Workers, Unraveling the Immigration Narrative. I was amused, George, to read early in the book where this title, We Wanted Workers, comes from. We wanted workers, but we got people instead. Isn't that the quip?
That's the quip. It all happened in terms of the German experience back in the 1950s and 1960s,
Yeah, yeah.
whereas Germany imported hundreds of thousands of guest workers, mainly from Turkey.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
other European countries did the same thing. And then a Swiss playwright novelist, Max Frisch, was sort of contemplating what was happening, and he came up with the phrase that we wanted workers, but we got people instead.
Yeah, how about
And
that?
the reason I like that phrase is because it's really one of the smartest things ever said about immigration. We economists tend to look at immigration from a very, very narrow perspective. This like economistic kind of perspective of like robotic workers moving from one place to the other.
Yeah,
And the fact is that immigrants are more than that. And not only do they have social consequences apart from the economic consequences, but the fact that they are people means that they themselves make decisions that affect all kinds of things and have all kinds of unintended consequences in the end as well. And that's the reason I like the title so much.
yeah, good title. Immigrants are people, which means that a lot comes with them besides their labor power. And economists tend to focus on exchange, markets, production, and calculate gains from immigration that don't necessarily weigh the cultural and social consequences attended to the fact that the immigrants are people. They come with a language, they come with habits and patterns and social and cultural.
That's right. That's
Uh,
right.
so tell me now, you say unraveling the immigration narrative. I kind of think I already know the answer to this question, but I'm going to
Right.
ask you anyway. What's the narrative, and why does it need to be unraveled?
The narrative, there's a very strong assumption, okay, if you read the social science literature on immigration, or if you hear the political debate on immigration from some quarters, right, that immigrants are good. And I actually have this quote in the book from Paul Collier, which I found really, really insightful. Paul Collier is an English public intellectual. He had never really written about immigration in his research. He's more of a development economist.
Hmm.
And then apparently he decided to write a book on immigration. And he must have read a lot of studies on immigration. And his insight that there was this sort of like narrative where social science was bending over backwards to sort of minimize the costs and exaggerate the benefits. And that's what I was trying to do a little bit. I wanted to make things a little more sort of on the open. A lot of what we do depends on assumptions. And as you well know, you can make different assumptions, which lead to different places. We look at data. You can look at particular kinds of data, which leads to different places again. And one of the objectives that I wanted to accomplish in this book was really just trying to set the record straight. What is it that people assume, and what is it that people do to the data to get this particular answer as opposed to that particular answer? And I wanted to show sort of systematically how by changing things ever so slightly, you can sort of get different perceptions. And I wanted to put it out in the open. So I wanted to people sort of read the book and decide what the reality was.
Okay, now let me see if I'm following you, George. You cite Collier, uh, and you're saying the books have been cooked a little bit. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm asking
No,
you, is this what you're saying? that a kind of consensus, a politically correct consensus, again, I'm asking, I'm not
Right,
trying to,
right, right, right.
that has led some kinds of economists, or maybe even most economists and most social scientists studying this issue, to bias their inquiries in a way that finds that immigration is good when it's not necessarily so as simple as that. Am
Let me,
I am I getting it?
I think you're close. Yeah. Let me paraphrase what Collier said. Okay. He basically said that in response to the xenophobes and the racists in society,
Yeah,
social scientists, and I'm paraphrasing, have strained every muscle to show that immigration is good for everyone.
yeah,
So the whole point that any change in social policy, whether in immigration or not, usually creates both winners and losers, tends to be sort of extracted out from the immigration discussion because everybody must gain. And a lot of the work, I'm not accusing anybody of doing this, okay? So let me be very careful about this. But a lot of the work happens to sort of, tends to phrase the benefits a little more strongly than tends to phrase the downside of it. And in reality, the fact is people both win and lose. They're winners and losers. Look, and there's a question they ask in the book, which is this. Would we be having an immigration debate at all if everybody in the U.S. had become much wealthier after we admitting 40 million immigrants?
okay.
You know, the fact that we're here now must have meant that somebody must not have joined in those gains.
Well, a person could say we'd be having a debate because it's not wealth that individuals are reacting to when they express their views about immigration. It's something else, like their notions of identity and integrity. You know, when Pat Buchanan, just to name a person, speaks out, you know, and I can remember him going back to the early 90s, you know, speaks out against immigration. He's saying, I don't want the character of my country to be determined by a kind of, you know, ungoverned flow of people coming across my border who speak a different language and have different ideas
Right.
than I do. And I'm trying to hold on to something. So that's not, you know, I can have everybody having an economic gain and they still feel threatened by that. So I'm not sure you're...
Look, there are people who clearly want the country as it is today in terms of the social component of it, right? Forget about economics. But the fact of the matter is that even if we look at economics, we know it's like trade. We know that trade may well create a net plus for the entire country,
Yeah.
but that doesn't diminish the fact that there are both winners and losers in trade. The way we usually trade, the way I teach trading class is that it's potentially good for everybody.
Yeah.
If one were to take the gains and redistribute them around.
Yeah.
The same is true for immigration. I mean, if you put aside the whole fiscal impact, there's no doubt about the fact that immigration increases the size of the pie. You know, abstracting from whatever happens on the fiscal side due to the welfare state, right? Just in terms of productivity.
Yeah.
And in theory, we could actually make everybody better off by redistributing wealth around. Now, I don't think we've done that. I mean, I think that if you look at the reality of things, there are certain groups of people in the U.S. who have clearly become worse off as a result of immigration. And some of what you're seeing today in the political debate is really a result of that. That there's this group of, you know, you see it in the paper all the time, a discussion about people left behind due to trade and immigration. And maybe if we had redistributed wealth, we'd be in a much better place right now in terms of that, of where the debate is going.
Let me ask you a question, George.
Yeah.
I hear you. I hear you. This is very interesting. I'm sitting here thinking about the following thing. I know a lot of people who are pro-immigration. I have a friend of mine. He happens to be a Mexican-American. He's a brilliant man. He's a community organizer. I love him. And, you know, he's pro-immigration. I mean, what am I going to tell you? He doesn't have a problem. And I know a lot of people who are anti-trade. Okay? Right. And he's one of them. He hates NAFTA to pieces. He says it's a disaster. Now, what I'm trying to get my mind around is how can that be? That seems like a logical inconsistency to me. You want people to move, but you don't want goods to move, as if the one and the other are not somehow substitutes for each other.
There's
I'm
also
not
the
going to
opposite.
name my friend. I'm not going to name him because I
No,
love
I
him.
understand. But there's also the opposite, right? There are people who are very much pro-trade
exactly.
and people who are very much anti-immigration.
Well, yeah, it's the flip side of the
Okay?
same coin. Yeah.
I actually understand the latter group, the pro-trade and the anti-immigration group, a lot better. Because that goes back to this phrase, we wanted workers, we got people instead.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? I find it harder to understand somebody who's against trade, but pro-immigration. Because immigration is it's like trade. You're importing, you're importing inputs in, right?
Yeah.
And to be pro-immigration but against trade is telling you something, I think, not so much about the economic impact of this, but telling you something about the fact that this person, your friend, is valuing something about the people that are coming in themselves, is valuing the diversity of culture, is valuing something that trade cannot provide.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Now, I got to ask you another question, George.
Yeah.
Please forgive me. It's just slightly personal. Anyone listening to us have this conversation will notice from the way you speak the English language that you're probably a native Spanish speaker.
I am.
And that would make you an immigrant in all likelihood. And so.
And a refugee. And a refugee as well.
Aha. Okay.
Okay.
How does that, and again, forgive me if you don't want to respond, that's fine, affect your study of these matters since, there's some identity stuff going around. People might, like I'm black, and if I'm against affirmative action, people say, they have a lot of things that they will say. I've heard a lot of those things.
I've heard it all. I've heard it all, okay?
Yeah.
I try not to think too much about that. I mean, I try to do the best work I can do that I can sleep with myself at night, okay? If you want to put it in that sense. I try to be honest to myself. I try to be honest in my work. And look, there are great things about immigrants, and there are things that are not so great about immigrants. And if you look at my body of work throughout, you tend to find that I'm trying to stress both things, that there are these benefits, but not everybody gains. I think I'm not a particularly ideological person. Even though I clearly have opinions about the way the world should be, I try those opinions not to really direct the way I do my research. I'm much more of an empirical person. I try to look at the data, and I try to come up with a story that sort of fits the data, and then let things take me where I am. But believe me, I've heard the accusations that I might not like immigrants, or that I might be anti-this, or immigration skeptic. That's one phrase that I hear a lot.
Yeah.
And it's not that immigration, this is something I talk about in the book too, Glenn. Suppose you take all the stuff I've done empirically correct, at face value, and that's correct. Okay, let's just suppose for a second. What does that imply about policy? And my answer will be not really all that much. And the reason is the following. The same empirical findings, the same empirical facts could have very different implications for policy depending on what it is you want policy to accomplish. I mean, one of the things that's always left out of the immigration debate is the question, what do you want immigration to accomplish? It's that set of values that really drives, in the end, most of what we want to do. I mean, for example, in this example I give in the book, we suppose that it's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that low-skilled immigration creates a fiscal burden. Okay, suppose that's a fact, okay, and that nobody can disagree with that. Does that mean we shouldn't admit any low-skilled immigrants? Well, on the one hand, if your objective is to save taxpayers' money, yeah, we shouldn't admit low-skilled immigrants. On the other hand, if your objective is to help poor people from all over the world have a chance at the American dream, then the fiscal burden is the price we're willing to pay.
Sure.
And to somehow, this is one of the big problems in political debate over immigration and some other issues as well, to somehow disconnect what the policy recommendations should be from the ideological question of what it is that we want to be, what kind of country do we want to be, is really a very misleading thing to do. Because numbers by themselves don't tell you what to do. You got to filter those numbers through an objective function. And the objective function is, what do we want immigration to be?
Yeah, I get it. I mean, this is the lecture. You're the Kennedy School professor that you're going to have to give. I get this. we sit there to do social science and to make our estimates and calculations, but at the end of the day, the decisions are going to be driven by our values and our goals. And it's very important to be clear about that and not to allow a conflict about values and goals to obscure our examination of evidence and our assessment of what's actually going on.
That's precisely the point.
I think that's got to be right, not just about this issue, but about any issue.
A lot of issues
that would come up. I think it could be helpful, George. I certainly learned a lot from your book. If we could just review some of the facts in broad strokes. I want to say for the record that anybody interested in this issue ought to read your book when it's available. We Wanted Workers, Unraveling the Immigration Narrative, because it's just so lucid in its treatment of the evidence, and it's extremely accessible, although it is rigorous in the way in which, I'm not an expert, but I'm an economist, and it looks to me like it's very carefully done. So it's a valuable contribution, and I thank you for it. But I'm wondering if you would want to. So, for example, I learned looking at your book that recent waves of immigrants coming to the United States are not assimilating in terms of economic measure at the same rate as earlier waves, and the graph is really quite striking. I learned that something like a quarter, 27% or something like that, of immigrants in the United States are from Mexico. I didn't know that, and that's the legal immigration that we're talking about. That's a big number, swamping any other country by far. And that the next three largest countries are from Asia. I learned looking at that, from India and China and Philippines, which was interesting. I learned that the percentage of immigrants with college degrees is almost equal to the American indigenous population, but that the percentage of immigrants without a high school degree is vastly higher than is the case for the American population as a whole, which interested me greatly. I learned that the scale of immigration is historically ongoing, although tapering off, has been rising rapidly over the last 30 years and is, quite large. I mean, you're talking 10 million people a year. Did I read that graph correctly?
1 million people a year.
Yep. That's a lot of folks.
Yeah.
So I'm just, I'm sorry, maybe I just summarized the facts you term. Right? These are facts that I learned in there, and I thought were really very much worth bearing in mind. Okay, let me ask you something else then. I mean, I have to ask you this, okay? There's a long discussion in the book assessing the impact of immigration on the wages of workers, low-skilled workers, and so forth and so on, parsing the evidence. I'm not going to ask you to review all of that, but I have in mind, of course, the impact on African Americans, low-skilled workers in the cities and so forth, and whether or not this is another one of these puzzles, because the coalition, let's identify with the Democratic Party, who seem to be much more favorable, and they talk about the demographic shift. They say Hispanics and blacks. They talk about minority country and things like this. This coalition would seem to have some pretty serious fault lines in it in terms of conflict of interest. Okay, I'm talking my friend Ernesto, friend I mentioned. I love him. He's a great man. I swear to you, he's a great man. But he and I have a hard time talking about what's going on at the low end of the LA labor market, where you're hiring people to work in restaurants or in hotels or in the furniture business or whatever. And I'm saying, oh man, all these black guys in South Central who end up in jail, maybe a few of them could get some of these $10 an hour jobs at some of these companies, But Jose and Manuel got the thing locked up, man. They got all their buddies coming from their village down in Mexico, and it's the employer network and whatever. We have a hard time talking about that. So I'm trying to raise this question of competition, especially at the low-skilled end, and the extent to which African-American workers are impacted is extremely sensitive. I know it's extremely sensitive, but it seems to me also extremely important.
Right. As you read the book, I'm sure you saw that ad that I had from Kreider in the South. And what happened was, back in 2006, the Bush administration had raided this particular chicken processing plant in Georgia, in rural Georgia. And as you would expect, when you raided a plant like that, a big chunk of its workforce was undocumented and was basically left overnight. Kreider responded in precisely the way that you would expect a profit-maximizing firm to respond. They literally placed ads in the paper. I have a copy of the ad in the book, sort of blaring increased wages. So the cut in supply, wages are higher. Many of the people that Kreider hired to replace the undocumented workers that have been taken away were African Americans, which were also the people that were hired prior to the influx of undocumented workers. It's rather revealing when the Wall Street Journal sent people back to that town to sort of see what happened, how the new workers, the African Americans that were hired to replace the undocumented, were sort of complaining about working conditions and trying to establish their legal rights. In terms of, they were not compliant workers like the undocumented workers were. And that's sort of the trade-off for firms, right? I mean, it's inevitable that an influx, like you said before, I forget the exact number, it's not in my head, but something like a quarter of high school dropouts in this country are foreign-born. So the increase in supply at the very low end of the market has been really dramatic in the last 10, 20 years, right? And you would expect, that ad indicates that when you have that increase in supply, it's going to hurt people at the bottom end. A lot of people at the bottom end happen to be minorities, whether African American or whether Hispanics. And those Hispanics are both native-born and foreign-born. So, of all the things that people sort of tend to agree, which aren't that many in terms of this very contentious issue, there's little doubt that people at the bottom end have been hurt by this. Now, some people tend to dismiss that completely by saying, well, look, so what? It's like trade. Somebody has to pay the price in order to have a gain. The auto workers paid the price back in the 1970s so you and I could have cheaper cars and benefit from that. Somebody has to pay the price for low-skill immigration. So we all get cheaper products in the supermarket. We get cheaper roof fixing, cheaper painters and stuff like that, right? But the problem is that think of what the welfare state is trying to do. They're trying to make people at the bottom end better off, right? Then you have this other social policy called immigration that is precisely the wrong kind of redistribution. It's redistributing wealth from the people who can least afford it to people like you and me. And you live in California. I'm sure you look around and you see a lot of upper middle class people gaining dramatically from undocumented migration.
That's a fact.
I mean, they probably have living maids and living cooks and living all kinds of stuff taking care of their lives for them. That's a huge, huge gain. But somebody's paying for that. And that's really the point that people tend to forget. Without some pain, there can be no gain. And the question is, you really want to put the pain at the very bottom end of the distribution? And if so, if you really care that much about people at the bottom end, isn't it a responsibility, and this is the point I try to stress in the book towards the end, isn't it a responsibility to ensure that immigration policy is thought of in a much broader context, not just in terms of how many immigrants to admit or which immigrants to admit, but also how to establish a system of redistribution that allows the people at the lower end to benefit as well from all this.
Okay. No, that's excellent. Thank you. There's I have to push back. Okay? And I'm channeling my buddy, the Social Democrat Ernesto, who is going to say solidarity. He's going to say the problem is that workers don't have a voice, that one set of workers is being set against another. Of course, we economists are going to assume some kind of competitive labor market and, the wage is going to clear for the various skill categories and so forth and so on. But my friend Ernesto, and I'm just using him as a
right.
Device here, he's going to be thinking about unions. He's going to be thinking about, bargaining, and he's going to be thinking about controlling the circumstances under which people work so that your chicken processor or whomever can't simply play one group off of another. And he's going to say that we analysts, going about with our green eye shades on measuring who gains and who loses, frame the debate. We can have immigration, but it's at the expense of, let's say, the low-skilled urban,
right.
African-American, Latino population, but who are residents or citizens of the United States. You're framing it in a kind of antagonistic way, where you could have framed it differently. You could have framed it as capitalist, money grubber mediating between, a consumer society that wants everything it wants when it wants it at the cheapest possible price, and a pretty much, vulnerable labor force that can be exploited to that end. And the fact that some of the people being exploited were born in Mexico and some of them were born in Chicago is a second order thing. The first order thing is workers uniting to ensure that, the adequate wages, working, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, right. My heart's not entirely in this speech. This is Ernesto's speech. But
I understand.
But I want to hear you react to it.
Believe it or not, I'm actually a little sympathetic to that perspective.
Yeah.
And that's why I sort of happen to really, this has been a very long evolution process for me to come to this point, okay? But I do think that worrying about immigration in such a narrow context of just how many people to come or which people come is not enough. We have to worry about making sure that the people are not left behind as well. And I don't know which is the best path forward to accomplish that, whether it's the arguments that your friend would make or whether it's something that would include, think of what people did for trade back in the 70s. They created all kinds of trade programs, trade assistance programs to help people affected by trade, right? So where the people gaining from trade will be taxed and some of that wealth will be going to the people affected by trade in terms of reskilling and retooling and letting them get better jobs. Well, it's about time we do something like that for immigration. Now, the problem with that, and I'm not naive about this, the problem with that is I suspect the following is true. The people who gain from immigration are not going to give up those gains without a big struggle. That's number one. And number two, if you look at the ideological parties who are in favor of very open migration policies, they tend to be a lot of libertarian type kind of people, right? They're not going to go along with a policy that is going to increase government by a tremendous amount to redistribute wealth.
Well, those are the Republicans who want open borders, but the Democrats who want open borders might have a different idea altogether.
They might.
Yeah.
But the question, I agree.
Let me ask you another question. It's going to be direct, okay?
Okay.
Here's a thought that occurred to me. I dared not speak it in my polite academic company, but the thought occurred to me. Here we have a political campaign in which people say certain key states, Colorado, Nevada, whatever, the Latino vote, the Hispanic vote, Republicans, Democrats fighting for the Hispanic vote, bidding for the Hispanic vote, okay, bidding for it with immigration policy. Who's going to be more lenient, who's going to be less hawkish, and so forth and so on. Now, the heretical thought that occurs to me is that there's something disquieting about the character of the country being negotiated in a political competition where a swing, in my model here is making the Hispanic/Latino vote like a swing vote that can be pivotal. Okay, it can determine the outcome one way or the other. The median voter in the theoretical models, and the idea is that by bidding for that vote, we actually, change the character of the country. So the character of the country. I didn't say it was good. I didn't say it was bad. Did you all hear me? I did not say it was bad. I just said it was changed. Okay, I said it was changed as a consequence of a bidding war for a minority's vote. I'm not sure that's the way you want to decide about the character of your country. That's where I'm coming out with this. God forgive me for even thinking the thought, but I want to know how you react to that thought.
I'll tell you a story about. I had a book almost 20 years ago called Heaven's Door.
Yeah,
and I had a paragraph written in that book where I said that if a particular group of people abroad wanted to change U.S. foreign policy, they didn't have to place bombs or murder people or commit all kinds of attacks. All they had to do was migrate. And I'm sure you know what I'm referring to, right? And I took it out. I took it out of that book because I figured it'd be a bit too, you know, too
Yeah.
controversial. Okay, and it gave me to trouble, right? But you're right. I mean, the fact of the matter is that different political parties play immigrants in a way that benefits them. Okay? And, you mentioned one particular way of looking at things, but there's another group of people who want immigrants because they're cheap. They're cheap labor, and they're laughing to the bank with this, and to hell with everything else that happens. Okay? I'm very worried about the fact that, like you said, there's a group of people who are now at the margin. I mean, and you can sort of see what happens to political equilibria when you have people moving around in places at the margin. That's actually a point I raised in the book as well. That's the whole reason why all this discussion about open borders and how great it would be and how there'd be these trillions of dollar gains is just completely misleading. Because they're forgetting about the fact that the whole equilibrium of the country is going to change afterwards. I don't know if it's going to change in a good way or a bad way, but the models we have cannot really be applied to predict what's going to happen in the future because of that. So it is very worrisome. But what can you do? The fact of the matter is, and in the US particularly, it's even more sensitive because of the fact that our politics are so decentralized. So you don't have to change the political structure overall that much, just in a few strategic places. And that will do the job.
There's a certain presidential candidate who, in a way, has summed this discussion we've had the last 5 minutes up by saying either you have a country or you don't. And that's why you didn't put that paragraph in your book, I imagine. It's very incendiary when it gets so raw. I mean, at one abstract level, it's a perfectly legitimate thing. What kind of country do we want to be? Cultural, immigrants can come, but they should assimilate. So this kind of talk. But at another level, it gets very raw and very visceral. And the words racist and nativist will come quickly to the tongues of some people on this kind of thing. So it's tough.
But I think that's a cop-out, okay? The reason they use those words is because they don't really want to address the debate head-on. The fact of the matter is that what really should drive immigration policy is what kind of country we want our children to live in. I mean, once we settle that, then it's really easy to sort of decide, well, we should go this way or that way. And I personally think we should be a country that welcomes immigrants. The United States has really been an exceptional country if you look for the last 2 centuries, right? In terms of attracting and welcoming people who really have very few opportunities elsewhere. And the question is, how can we do that without it becoming a political football? And where we are now in the debate is the fact that it has become a political football. The fact that we have a lot of, think of it this way, the fact that we have let in basically over 11 million people, undocumented, people into the country, has really made the immigration debate much, much less rational, because we're focusing so much on that we can really think about the important things. So my blame will be on those people who let that happen, because by letting that happen, they're basically taking away the opportunity for the U.S. to continue playing its role.
Well, that's very interesting, passionately put as well. And I'm glad that we're now talking about the 11 million. And if I read you right, you're not sure that that's not an underestimate. That could be a significant underestimate, although
it could be. But
we don't know because we don't know. Talk about the 11 million, because when people talk about immigration reform and these words like amnesty and path to citizenship and all these kind of things come up. And, I studied a little game theory in my career, and one of the things that immediately occurs to me is, commitment. I mean, the people are here, and people are saying it. Of course, it's true. You're not going to go door to door and round people up, separate families, and ship millions of people. We're not going to do it. Okay, so, but John Kasich is saying this. I mean, so bottom line is, as a de facto matter, most of those people are going to be somehow or another accommodated here in the United States. But if you can't commit yourself to not letting somebody who comes in without documentation stay, They're going to keep coming. I mean,
It's like I think Hillary Clinton said the other day that she's gonna allow every single child or under 18
yeah, I
person
saw
to
that.
stay.
Yeah, I saw
Okay,
that.
well, that's
And
an open invitation to every single young person in the world, right? Look, in my book, I want to say two things about this. Number one is it's a whole issue of commitment. You really cannot discuss rationally what to do with the 11 million people right now unless you commit yourself not to have to face that problem in the future again. So it makes no sense to talk about immigration policy changes unless we somehow prevent this problem from getting worse. So something has to be done at this point to stop the flow. That's number one. Number two, the fact of the matter is, given the way that current law is written, we don't really need to do that much for those 11 million people. And the reason is this. As current law stands, most of those people will eventually have family connections that allow them to change their status. And all we will need to do at some point in the future, once we have a credible policy in place, is really just speed up the process of providing those family visas. I mean, I bet you right now, one way to take a good survey of this, a big chunk of those 11 million people will qualify for something in the future. Because most of them already have, I don't know how many, but I bet you a lot have children. A lot of those people have children born in the US, who are US citizens. Well, once those children turn 18, they can sponsor their parents. So we're not going to kick the parents out, but we can address this in a much less contentious way if we had a credible policy in place.
okay, let me see if I understand you, George, because this is really quite interesting. I think you're saying, like Marco Rubio and others have said, we can't really resolve the problem about the undocumented workers in our midst until we have secured the border. You didn't say those words, but that's what it sounded like to me.
Right.
Second thing you said is that, yes, as a matter of fact, as I heard you, correct me if I'm wrong, most of those people are going to stay. And you know what? We don't really have to have some kind of grand transformation of immigration law in order to make that happen. All we need to do is utilize the provisions in existing law that give preference to family members for legal residency, and the fact that many, or even most of those 11 million will have family members who would be in a position of being able to sponsor them in that way, so that we could, if we were to control the border over time, integrate the existing people into a legal status. And that could even be made a explicit object of policy. You could see promoting that, like Obamacare. You want to get people to sign up. You could go around and try to process people in this way to, quote, legalize them, to make them to make them legal. And you think we could really deal with the 11 million or so in that way, or the great majority of them?
I would say most of them. Okay, I don't know the exact number because I don't have a survey. But look, if you stay in the U.S. for a while, you will meet someone. You will procreate. These children will grow up. And for most people, that probably will not be a bad path. Now, you'll recognize this phrase because you go way back in this debate. This sort of reminds me of Daniel Moynihan's phrase about benign neglect. And this is not a bad policy to have in this context.
Have you written that op-ed, or is that in the book?
It's in the book. It's at the very end of the book. The very end of the book.
Forgive me.
The very end of the book.
No, that's good. That's good. No, that's that. So, which presidential candidate are you advising?
Well, I have not been contacted by anyone, and I have not been advising anybody.
Oh.
So you might find that hard to believe, but I really have not been contacted by anyone.
Well, sounds like an opportunity is being missed for somebody, because you're making a lot of sense here. George, I want to thank you for giving your time and talking about your book here at the Glenn Show. It's been a real pleasure for me.
Oh, thank you, Glenn, so much. I really appreciate it, okay?
Okay, thank you.